How do you fuel and prepare for a long bike ride? You're doing 100 miles on your own or in an event like an organised sportive, which I'm doing this weekend in a Fred Whitton Challenge. What's the best strategy? Real food like bananas or gels like this? To find out, I'm joined in this video by Andy Turner, a professional cycling coach who shares the latest advice on how to ride and survive 100 miles. So let's dive in. So Andy, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining us. So let's dive straight in. I'm riding 100 miles at the weekend. Should I use real food or gels? What's your recommendation?
I would generally say to people that real food is probably the best way to go, but it's, as with a lot of these things, it depends. So I know when I was racing, I found it quite difficult to deal with real food when the intensity is quite high. So with the Fred Whitton coming up, if you're going up a climb, and so it's a particularly long one, you're probably going to struggle to eat something like a flapjack. It's going to take quite a bit of chewing. Even some energy bars take a good amount of chewing to get down. So I think there's a time and a place for gels and energy drinks, but the other thing to consider is sort of how you deal with them personally. I know some people can do 12 hours off energy drinks and gels and a load of massively processed sugar and not have any ill effects. Whereas I know if I've not done much in the way of training my gut, if I go straight into high carb energy gels, I regret it for about 2 days. I think the other element is you can train your gut by using the nutrition that would be optimal in your event in training. It also depends on temperature as well. That has an impact on how much in the way of carbohydrates you use, but also how well your body can deal with processing food. And obviously, you've got to drink quite a lot as well, so that changes factors as well. Um, but yeah, looking to this weekend, it's I'd say warm, but not excessively so. Um, in terms of hydration, you can you don't have to be drinking exactly what you lose in the events, but it's not sort of over the temperature threshold that you're going to need an excessive amount more carbs than what you'd normally need. So my advice is sort of fuel the way that you normally would for an event like this. You don't want to try anything novel coming into an event for the first time. But yeah, with the duration of that, the sort of time that it's going to be going on for, there'll be occasions where you can eat real food. So if you're on a descent that's not overly technical, that's a good opportunity to eat something. I'd also advise if you're having things like flapjacks or malt loaf, having something to drink with it as well will just make it a lot easier to process. But then if you're finding that you're flagging a bit, getting the carbs in quickly with energy drink or energy gels, especially if you swirl them around in the mouth a bit like with mouth rinsing carbs, it gets more glucose into the bloodstream quickly. And yeah, I think sort of quite often what a lot of people will do is they'll start on more real foods, and then as they're getting more fatigued, they'll go to the sort of more easily digestible, fast acting carbohydrates. But that also depends on how you pace your own event. I know recently I went way too hard at the start of a 200 kilometer gravel ride and had to fuel quite aggressively, but hadn't trained using that much fuel for quite a while and really suffered the last half of the event.
I guess it depends how fast you plan to go. That life is a race. You're going flat out from the gun, but hopefully, fingers crossed, on a Fred Whitton, and for most people doing a sportive, they're probably going to take it fairly steady and ease into it. So I guess you can do solid food, bananas, flapjacks early on, and then go to gels when you're getting tired towards the end of the ride when the climbs, especially in Fred Whitton, come with like 90 miles to go, the climbs start to come in earnest. So I guess it's use gels later on when you're pretty tired. It's easy to get that energy down into you, isn't it? Really. So, but it's finding a solution that works for you, I guess, and then try and like when it comes to real food, like gels take a lot less space than bananas and flapjacks. You get a lot more of these in your pocket than and there are feed stations but you don't know what the food might be there. It might be great, it might be rubbish. It depends on sportive. So if you are buying your own gels, I guess you can get loads of these in your pocket compared to a load of bananas.
Yeah, that's another point. So that's why I tend to go energy drinks as well, because if I have two 1 litre bottles on the bike, if it's a long event, I have about 200 grams of carbs in each bottle, and then gels stuffed down the pockets, bar bag, anywhere and everywhere, really, to keep me going. But yeah, from experience, it's sort of with when I used to race, I was training using energy drinks, gels, sort of chew bars, and all sorts of quite artificial carbs. But I trained my gut to be able to deal with about 100, 120 grams of carbs an hour. And in the races, absolutely fine. But having had the time off training, off racing, and training differently and not fueling in the same way, I can't do that anymore. So I made that mistake going into an event and thinking, oh, I'll just do what I used to do. And my body was just, no, not going to do that. Thank you.
So that's a risk of overeating, perhaps, is it? Like if your body's not used to having the amount of food you're going to plan to eat on a sportive, your body could reject it, and then you could be in worse trouble. So how do you
Essentially,
know
yes.
how much to eat? I guess is sort of the next question. Like, is it little and often? Do you listen to your body? I guess you want to eat before you get hungry, because you get hungry, you're probably too late. Then you're gonna hit a wall and you bonk, which we're trying to avoid, aren't we? Trying to keep the legs spinning, hopefully, and avoid hitting the wall. So, how much do you eat? How do you know? Is there a plan? Is there a strategy here for how much to eat?
So generally, what a sort of good base? So I mean, this event's going to be over 4 hours, and generally, the optimal fueling would probably be between 100 and 120 grams of carbs an hour. But
Okay.
that's optimal based on you being able to tolerate that, because our bodies can tolerate 60 grams of glucose an hour. So if you're having just an energy drink or gels with glucose, you don't want to push it beyond 60 an hour, which is where you get the multi-source, multi-transportable carbs, and that relates to fructose as well, which I don't think there's much of a limit of what you can consume with that per hour, which is why it used to be 60 grams an hour was the maximum. Then it was 90 with a 2-to-1 ratio glucose to fructose. And then research has continued, and now they say sort of about 120 grams an hour is the maximum the body can actually process and oxidize. So that's you see these energy drinks. I think it's a 0.8 to 1 ratio fructose glucose, and that is the sort of multi-transportable. So the glucose is transported into the bloodstream via one method, and the fructose is transported via another. So that bypasses that 60-gram limit. But if you're not used to consuming that amount, it puts quite a bit of stress on the gut. It's not going to have the enzymes to process that amount. And then you get the issues like the infamous 2017 Giro, Tom Dumoulin jumping off the side of the road to go and do his deed.
Not good. Don't want
No.
that
So
for
that
you.
was sort of one of the early days of teams experimenting with far higher carbohydrate loads. And when it goes wrong, which is why you have to ensure that you're using it in training and getting that part right. And you can often see with a lot of sports nutrition whether it's a glucose or glucose fructose mix and what the ratios of that are.
But for us, like amateurs, we're not racing, we're doing sporties. Is there a sort of safe limit to aim for? Like you mentioned 60 is like the lower and 120 is the upper. Can we aim somewhere in the middle? Is there somewhere we need body weight as a sort of measure for how many carbs we need, grams of carbs we need during an event?
It's an interesting one because they've done quite a bit of research into the effect of sort of body weight on carb metabolism, and it doesn't really have an effect.
Okay.
So a rider who is 50 kilos can if they've optimized their gut training, they can metabolize the same amount of carbohydrates as a rider who is 90 kilos. So it's why lighter riders potentially have a enhanced benefit of exogenous fueling, so consuming additional carbohydrates. um, but I'd say 60 grams an hour is the safe place to start from, because your body will be able to process that. But given that 60 grams of carbs is about 4 calories per gram of carbs, so 240 calories there. If you're riding at 200 watts an hour, you're burning about just under 700 an hour, I think it is, calories.
Okay.
So that won't all be coming from carbs, but depending on the intensity that you're riding at, that's going to dictate where it's coming from as well.
Mm.
So that 240 calories being consumed, if you're going at a higher intensity and sort of high rate of that energy is coming from carbs, you need to eat more than that. But obviously, you can't have 3 times more of that because that would be 180 grams of carbs an hour. And you've got the carbs stored in your glycogen stores in the body.
Yep.
You've got being able to use fat as fuel as well, which is why people can't ride at threshold for hour after hour. There just isn't the physical fuel to do so. But for people wanting to fuel their events, 60 is a good place to start because you're not going to get any adverse side effects from that. And then ideally, what you want to do is practice in training, building that up. So going up to 80, building up to 100, and even 120. Um, Another factor, obviously, is cost because 120 grams of carb drink is expensive. But my little get around for that is white sugar, which is a 1-to-1 ratio fructose glucose, pretty close to all these sports drinks. Little bit of salt, little bit of squash or concentrate,
Okay.
and then wait 2 hours after the event and brush your teeth well.
Homemade energy drink. That's good. 'Cause these gels aren't cheap. I bought these the other day, and these are 40 grams per gel. So I figured a few of those with some energy powder in my bottle should keep me sort of, at a minimum 60, 70 grams per hour, and I hope keep them ticking over. When it comes to sort of getting your energy from gels, energy drinks, a balance. I guess you need to keep drinking. Hydration's key. Electrolytes. Is it best to have just water in your bottles, or electrolyte, or energy drink in there, or get all your energy from gels and bananas and flapjacks? Again, I guess it
I'd
depends, but
Yeah, I'd say it comes quite a lot to personal preference. So
okay.
with the ones I did, I had the sugar and I'd add salts to it as well. So I'd sort of try and make my ideal electrolyte balance. Um, but I was always quite happy having just energy drinks, whereas a lot of the riders I work with, especially at races, you ask like, do you want energy or water in the bottles? And especially come the end of the race, actually, is when people start wanting water because you get a bit of fatigue of just having
Yeah.
sweet stuff constantly. I mean, Geraint Thomas at the Giro recently had his plate of rice with soy sauce on it, and I
I
saw
saw
people
that, yeah.
criticizing that. And I just thought, damn, I wish I'd brought soy sauce with me to every stage race I did.
Yeah, it must have been so
'Cause
like salty and not sweet, and yeah,
yeah, so sometimes just having an electrolyte drink that's a little bit sort of tastes almost a little bit salty and not that over sweet can actually be quite good for morale come the end of the rides. Um, so again, it comes down to personal preference. Some people like a mix of energy in one bottle, water in another, especially on a hot day. If you want to douse yourself in a drink, you're not wanting to do that with a sugary carb mix.
yeah, definitely.
So having the water option can be useful on that front as well. And then when you've got the feed stations, it does give you the option. A lot of them have, I think, energy top ups. Not they're normally about 40 grams per bottle generally, but some have electrolyte top ups as well. So again, it comes very much to personal preference. I'd say the optimal would be energy drink with electrolytes in there. But again, it's that you've got to train yourself to be able to stomach that drink. And if it's a hotter day, then it starts to shift in terms of how you balance it. I'd say probably a lower carb concentrate. So rather than say 500 mil with 100 grams of carbs, you might go for 500 mil with 50 grams because you'll be drinking more fluid, or 500 mil with 100 grams and another 500 mil just water. So you can alternate.
Mm.
Because the other thing is, in hotter temperatures, you use more carbohydrates as fuel because essentially when your body is under more stress, you use more carbohydrates. So whether that's if you're fatigued, working at a higher intensity, at altitude, or working at higher temperatures, a sort of good rule of thumb, if the heart rate goes high, you're probably using more carbs, regardless of what the power meter is saying.
That's good advice. Um, so I guess the takeaway is like not to use your big event to try new nutrition strategies. It's do it in training. And
Yeah, so it can be easy to think if you've been training at 60 grams an hour and you come to this big event and you think, oh, all these articles and these nutrition companies are saying 120 is the optimum, what you should be consuming. Don't jump into that into the event. Use what is tried and tested for you, what you know will work. Um, it's a bit like, I don't know, changing tire pressures drastically in a race just to see what it's like. Probably not the right time to because it's going to affect the handling and the feel of the bike for the first time. And you don't want to find that you sort of do this aggressive carb fueling with 120 grams, and then 2 hours into the event, you're feeling really quite sick, to be honest.
yeah, yeah, I think so. Given you've decided what you're going to do during the event in terms of taking gels, flapjacks, bars, what can we do to make sure the event starts at 8 a.m. in the morning? What can we do to make sure we are best prepared for that start in terms of like carb loading? Is that a myth or is that still a thing? What's the best thing to do like in the morning and the day leading up to the event? Make sure we're as fresh as possible and ready to go and not like tired or empty for that ride.
Yeah, so carb loading's been something that's been around for decades now, and there's been varying methods of how to do it. Sort of some people say you go very low carb for a few days beforehand, and then like 2 days before you up the carbs loads. But a lot of the research now shows that that doesn't really make any difference. It just impacts training in before the event and potentially
Okay.
recovery. So if the event starts, was it 8 in the morning roughly?
I think it started between like 6 and 8. I think it was
Okay, so
yeah,
quite early.
quite early.
Ideally, you wouldn't want to have a really heavy meal closer than 2 hours before the event.
Mm,
So you're probably looking at, you're still going to want to have something, but you're going to want to prioritize low fiber, low volume. Um, so if you were going to have porridge rather than rolled oats, you'd want to go for cut oats. Um, Personally, for me, I'm slightly lactose intolerant, so I do it with water rather than milk.
yeah,
You'd probably put honey on top and some raisins rather than grapes,
yeah.
just because it's lower volume, less fiber, less effort for your body to digest it, essentially. So that would be quite a good pre-event meal. So probably 2 hours before.
Mhm.
You can go a little bit closer if you're not going to go off from the gun like a rocket. Um, but then you're sort of looking at the night before what you're having. So you're going to want to have a sort of go back from lunch the day before. So lunch, still going for fairly carby, but probably sort of what you'd call lower glycemic index, a little bit more in the way of fiber. So it's slower release. You're not getting that spike and crash. So whole grain breads, lentils, pulses, beans, things like that are or lower glycemic index, and that'll go towards topping up the carb stores. You're probably looking at 100, 120 grams with your lunch there. Like, carbohydrates, probably similar again when you get to dinner. Rice is a good one because it's very high in carbohydrates per weight of rice. Um, but with that being quite a high glycemic index, you sort of want to have something with that. So having it with fats and proteins will slow the release of the energy. So you probably want that about 4 hours before bed. Again, sort of that 100, 120 grams of carbs. Um, and then before you go to bed, just a sort of slightly lighter carbs and maybe a yogurt or something. So a bit of granola and yogurt, bit of fruit, be quite a good one because you don't want to have a really heavy meal before going to bed because you want to have a good sleep because that's going to have a huge impact on performance the next day as well. But you don't have to do the whole 3 or 4 days of heavy carb loading leading up to it. I'd say because people are going to still be riding their bikes, so you still want to fuel your training properly as you're doing it, even if it's easy rides. Ensure that after your sessions, you're having a good amount of carbohydrates and protein. Generally, it's a 3-to-1 ratio carbs to protein, which optimizes both muscle glycogen replenishment and muscle protein synthesis. So that will ensure better recovery. So you're coming into the event fresher and nicely fueled up.
Almost sounds like you're eating normally in the day leading up to the event and the day before. You're not trying to overeat, which can be a temptation. I think lots of people fall into. Like, there's almost an excuse to eat a big pile of food, and then you can feel like bogged down by all the extra food. We've not mentioned protein. Is there any need for like protein in the morning, before, during the event, or is it all about carbs? Carbs.
It's not really any point having protein during, especially if you're going to be working at a sort of tempo intensity. Protein takes more energy to break down. So you might have heard of sort of like classic examples, probably the meat sweats.
Okay,
You
yeah, yeah, yeah.
get warm and your body uses more energy because you're trying to break down something that requires more energy to break down. So it's like the thermic effect of food. Fats require virtually no energy to process, carbs a little bit more, protein quite a lot, dairy a little bit more, depending on the person. So protein during a ride, your body's not going to be prioritizing muscle protein synthesis. You're going to want to be fueling the work. The carbohydrate consumption is going to be better for recovery than protein consumption. Before the event itself, potentially a little bit, but again, keep it fairly easy to digest. So something like a whey protein powder mixed in is going to be better because it's a more fast acting, more easily digestible one than opposed to casein protein. Um, Whereas with the night before and other meals in the day, you just want to keep it fairly normal to what you'd have. Um, Sort of a good one. It's sort of like when they say if you've got a plate, have a fistful of protein,
Okay.
fistful of veg, and you're probably looking at two fistfuls of carbs with the lead up to events like this.
Quite an easy system to remember how much to eat. I think one of my
Yeah,
worst days on the bike ever was Dartmoor Classic many years ago. And for some reason, I had a mixed grill the night before, and I had a terrible night's sleep, and a terrible day on the bike, and it was hot, and I had to sweat all day. So yeah, you learn from your mistakes. I think, don't you? You definitely learn from your mistakes, and it's always advice out there. It's definitely, I mean, there's more advice out there than there used to be 10, 20 years ago, but it's still a case of trying what works for you and finding a system that works for you, like in
I
terms of
think that's
preparation.
I think that's a lot of the problem. There's a lot of information out there,
Yeah, overwhelming, isn't
and
it?
yeah, there's so much information, but it's trying to work out the quality of the information as such.
Yeah,
So when you look at the studies on carbohydrates, this is a good example that if you do a research study on carbohydrate tolerance and you just take random people from the general public, you'll find that their maximal tolerance is probably 60 grams an hour because they've done no gut training, no GI training. They're not used to consuming that volume of carbohydrates. When you take, say, some amateur racers, you might find that it jumps up to a range of 60 and 120 with an average of around 90-ish. And that's what the information will say, but it's not, it's very broad in who it impacts. Then you've got the world tour riders who are just basically professional eaters, and you get a very different picture. So it's really, you've got to trial and error what works for you. Have a look at the research, read what's out there, but have a critical view of it. Even scientific peer reviewed papers have their faults, and it's easy to look into it when you see the methods and who they've tested it on. But at the end of the day, it is try what works for you. In the same way that obviously you get all these long and low race bikes which promise to be this much quicker at 46 kilometers an hour. But I know if I jumped on Mathieu van der Poel's Canyon Air Road, I'd probably have a bit of a sore back and pain in my hamstrings by the end of a ride there, and I wouldn't be traveling at 46 kilometers an hour, whereas a giant Defy is probably going to be more suitable for me now
Yeah.
based on flexibility, based on the amount of riding and training I do, the speeds that I ride at and where I train. So it's you've got to be sort of quite self-aware and do what works for you and practice and experiments, because training's a great place to trial and error, because if it goes wrong, there's nothing on the line.
Yeah.
But events are not the time to try something completely novel.
And during an event, if something does go wrong, like your legs fall off, or you just have a bad turn, or you hit the wall, bonk, what can you do? Is there anything you can do? Is it like game over, or can you kind of come back from the
It's
brink?
it's a difficult one, because one of the so when you look at time trials, they do negative split pacing, so they start easier and then they ramp it up.
Yeah.
And part of that is if you start too hard, like especially when we're looking at these long endurance events, you're probably working at around what's referred to as your first lactate threshold. So beyond that, fatigue starts to increase more. And if you do a load of really high intensity efforts at the start, it actually drops your lactate threshold one
Okay.
relative to your sort of overall performance. So it's fatigue impacts it in the same way heat and altitude do. So then you're using more carbs, you're building more fatigue metabolites. So it's why pacing's quite important. So I messed up massively at my last event. I went with a fast group and thought, I used to be this fit. I'm sure I can keep up. Out the back in 10 minutes, and so done a 10-minute max heart rate at the start.
Ouch.
I was fine till 100k in, and then I struggled with the fueling, and I was riding along at a pace much lower than I'd normally do, but a heart rate quite a bit higher.
Okay.
So the threshold had dropped relatively.
So you paid the
So
price for that early effort, basically, and that second half of the
massively so, I hated that last 100k.
ride. So it's trying to, well, but doing a sportive where you're not racing, it's trying to resist getting carried away in the early climbs. There are some early climbs, Fred Whitton, not get carried away in a group, even if it looks tempting to go faster, and trying to almost ride easier than you think you should, or feels easier, going slower than you think you should be going, to try and save
It's
for that second half of the ride when it really kicks
It's
in.
a tough one to gauge, because obviously on the flats, if you're with a group, you'll save a significant amount of time,
Yeah.
especially with a road event. Gravel, you don't have quite the same effect with drafting, but you don't want to really overdo it on the climbs. I mean, given the amount of people riding the Fred Whitton, I think, say you're on a climb and you're with a group that from the start of that climb, it's just feeling way too hard.
Mm.
That's the point where you sort of think, okay, I'm just going to pace myself up here. If you have a group and you're say 100 meters from the top and you can feel yourself slipping a little bit, it's probably worth pushing on that a little bit just to stick with them going over the top and on the descent, because you'll probably find for the next, say it's 5 miles till the next climb, that 5 miles, if you're on the back of a group, you'll be going quicker for a lot less energy. So the sort of weighing it up, it's worth the effort at that point. But if you're 2 minutes into a 20-minute climb and you're really hanging on the wheels, that is not the time to try and push on to keep going. I mean, Ben O'Connor tried going with Pogacar on that climb, and the result was he slipped back behind the people who were chasing him. So it's that sort of pacing out. And he said afterwards that he should have just gone his own pace there. It would have been quicker, because he did that big effort, blew up, and then couldn't work at as high an average as he would have been able to on that climb.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's really, really good advice that, isn't it? Like pace yourself, listen to your body, and make it cool. Even if it's a tough one and you mean dropping from the group, it'll be better that overall time, isn't it? So
Yeah, and in terms of sort of if you are feeling like you're really blowing up, the key thing is drop the intensity a good amount. Do that carb swelling in your mouth, sort of try and get energy in quickly. Hopefully, you won't get to that point if you've been doing that. My go-to emergency was just double espresso with about 6 sugar packets in it. That gets sugar in the system quickly.
yeah.
But quite often, if you're at that point, you've got to do quite little and often. So I had that in that event. I did, and energy drink would I'd have a sip of that, feel great for 5 minutes, blow up again, sip again, 5 minutes great, blow up again.
Wow.
It was not ideal.
That sounds horrendous. I'll hopefully be avoiding that in Fred Whitton. Before we run out of time, any last tips or bits of advice for us people doing sporties and Fred Whittons?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of it in terms of you want to make sure you sort of pace yourself. You're not going to go too much into the red too soon, especially with it being back ended with the climbs. You want to start your fueling from the off. You want to go in with a strategy. Say if it's, I don't know, have a bit of drink every 20 minutes or a gel every half hour and sip of drink, energy drink in between that, and sort of stick to that plan. And that should hopefully result in you not trying to play catch up later on. Because if it won't work if you do 20 grams of carbs in the first 2 hours and then 240 in the next 2 hours, it's not going to happen. Um, Gearing is a big one. Make sure you've got light enough gearing, because if
Yeah.
you're grinding up those climbs, that's going to really fatigue the leg muscles come the end of it as well. And also making sure you enjoy it. So I mean, that's something I regret with events I've done where I've gone into it and blown up, is you just don't enjoy the rest of it.
Okay, I'll hopefully put your advice to good use. And next time we chat, we'll talk about ketones. We're out of time to talk about that next time. So yeah, thanks for your time, Andy. I'll put a link to Andy's coaching website down below. If you need a coach or more advice, but yeah, thanks for your time, and hopefully the ride will go nice and smoothly.
Yeah, thanks for having me and good luck with this weekend.
Thank you.